Come to my house. Don't tell anyone where you're going.
His voice was calmer than I expected. I thought this was my chance to finally prove that I wasn't a mistake, that I was worth being loved by him. I grabbed my shoes and left. My adoptive mother was in the kitchen.
Where are you going?
Just out for a bit. I didn't want to ruin the moment by revealing where I was headed. I felt this was a personal step forward, something my parents didn't need to be involved in, especially after my grandfather had instructed me to not tell them. When I arrived at my grandfather's house, something felt off. The curtains were drawn, and the house was eerily quiet.
Come in.
Once I stepped inside, I saw two large men sitting on the couch, staring at me. They stood up the moment I entered, and before I could say a word, they grabbed me. "What are you doing? Let me go!" They dragged me down a hallway, ignoring my screams and struggles. My grandfather followed behind, his face blank, showing no remorse.
Take him to the back.
The men shoved me into a small, dark room and slammed the door shut. I heard the lock click, and my heart sank. Let me out, please.
You'll stay there until you're gone for good. No one will miss you. You were never supposed to be part of this family.
My adoptive father was my grandfather's only son out of his 3 kids. My adoptive mother's parents were long gone by the time she married my father, and so she was fully absorbed into his family. When they got married, it was a joyous occasion. Everyone celebrated the union, including my grandfather, who often bragged about how lucky my father was to have found such a loyal and hardworking woman. But 2 years passed, and there was no child. Another 2 years came and went, and the whispers began. My grandfather's patience wore thin. He started questioning my mother during family gatherings.
Why haven't you given my son a child yet? Is something wrong with you?
My father tried to defend her, but my grandfather was relentless.
Maybe she's barren. What kind of woman doesn't give her husband a child after 4 years?
My mother endured the humiliation in silence, but when they finally went for tests, the results revealed the truth. My father was impotent. My grandfather was furious.
How can this be? My only son can't give me a grandchild? What kind of curse is this?
Despite the blame and anger directed at him, my father sank into quiet shame. He couldn't look anyone in the eye. But my mother didn't waver. She proposed the idea of adoption.
I love you, and we can still have a family. Let's adopt a child and raise them as our own.
It took months of convincing, but my father eventually agreed. That's how I came into their lives. I was 2 years old, a quiet boy with wide eyes who didn't know what was happening when they brought me home. The rest of the family was hesitant at first, but they grew to accept me. All except my grandfather.
This boy is not your blood. He's not one of us, and he never will be. Worse is, he is black gush.
He said it directly to my parents, as though I weren't standing right there. I may have been small, but I understood the hatred in his voice. From then on, every interaction with him was a reminder that I didn't belong. If my parents brought me to visit him, he would leave the room.
Why do you keep bringing that boy here? I don't want him in my house.
He refused to sit with me at family dinners. If I tried to greet him, he would look right past me, as though I were invisible.
Don't force me to acknowledge what isn't mine.
I remember one Christmas when the entire family gathered at his house. The adults were laughing, the kids were playing, and there I was, sitting in a corner, watching it all from a distance. The kids were running around, but every time I tried to join them, my grandfather would call them over.
Don't mix with him too much. He's not like you. He will probably end up in prison someday. They never amount to anything.
I overheard those words, and they stayed with me. I didn't understand why he hated me so much, but it was clear that nothing I did could change it. One day, when I was about 7, my parents took me to visit him again. I was excited, hoping that maybe this time would be different. Maybe he would smile at me, or talk to me like he did with my cousins. But as soon as we arrived, he frowned. I stood there.
Why is he here again? I told you I don't want to see that boy in my house.
He's your grandson, whether you like it or not.
He's not my grandson. He's a stranger you brought into this family. I know that you forced my son to do this. He's our son, Dad. He deserves your love and respect. Respect? For someone who isn't even ours? Never.
Holding my mother's hand, tears stinging my eyes. She knelt down beside me and hugged me tightly, whispering words of comfort, but it didn't help. The damage was done. As I grew older, the hatred became more blatant. My grandfather started excluding me from family traditions. When he handed out gifts, there was always one less for me. When he shared stories of our lineage, he would pointedly say things like,
"This is for my real grandchildren I know, not the adopted ones."
I tried my best to win his approval. I brought home good grades, hoping he'd notice. I offered to help him with chores during family visits, but he would wave me away.
"Don't touch that. You'll ruin it. You'll stain it."
It wasn't just his words. It was the way he looked at me, as though I were a burden, an inconvenience. My parents tried to shield me from it, but there was only so much they could do. They loved me fiercely, and I knew they were doing everything they could to make up for the gap my grandfather created. One day, when I was 12, my grandfather fell ill. My parents insisted on visiting him, and they brought me along despite his protests. I sat quietly in the corner of his room, watching as my mother fussed over him, and my father tried to make him comfortable.
"Why did you bring him here?"
Because he's your grandson, and he deserves to be here.
"He's not my grandson. He's just a reminder of what I'll never have."
The words stung, but by then, I was used to them. I stayed quiet, not wanting to upset my parents further. As the years went on, my relationship with my grandfather didn't improve. I stopped trying to win his affection and focused on building my own sense of worth. My parents were my rock, always reminding me that I was loved and valued. When I turned 16, I decided to confront him one last time. It was at a family gathering, and I found him sitting alone in the garden, staring at the sky. "I just want to know why, Grandpa. Why do you hate me so much?"
"Because you're not one of us. You'll never be."
"Grandpa, I didn't ask to be adopted. I didn't ask to be brought into this family. But I am here, and I'm not going anywhere. Can't you try to love me, please?"
"Get out. You irritate me. Your biological parents hated you. That is why they abandoned you at the orphanage, so get out. I do not want to inhale the same air as someone who isn't part of my family. Get lost."
On my 18th birthday, my grandfather didn't even call. He never attended my other birthdays or even called, but I'd hoped it would be different on my 18th. Unfortunately, it wasn't. About a week later, my grandfather suddenly called me. I was shocked, stunned, and excited. I thought, maybe, after all this time, he had a change of heart. Maybe he wanted to make amends.
"Come to my house. Don't tell anyone where you're going."
His voice was calmer than I expected. I thought this was my chance to finally prove that I wasn't a mistake, that I was worth being loved by him. I grabbed my shoes and left. My adoptive mother was in the kitchen.
Where are you going?
Just out for a bit. I didn't want to ruin the moment by revealing where I was headed. I felt this was a personal step forward, something my parents didn't need to be involved in, especially after my grandfather had instructed me to not tell them. When I arrived at my grandfather's house, something felt off. The curtains were drawn, and the house was eerily quiet.
"Come in."
Once I stepped inside, I saw two large men sitting on the couch, staring at me. They stood up the moment I entered, and before I could say a word, they grabbed me. "What are you doing? Let me go!" They dragged me down a hallway, ignoring my screams and struggles. My grandfather followed behind, his face blank, showing no remorse.
"Take him to the back."
The men shoved me into a small, dark room and slammed the door shut. I heard the lock click, and my heart sank. "Let me out, please."
"You'll stay there until you're gone for good. No one will miss you. You were never supposed to be part of this family."
I collapsed onto the cold floor, stunned. My grandfather didn't just hate me, he wanted me dead. He intended to starve me, to erase me from his life completely. The room was pitch black, with no furniture, no water, and no way out. I screamed until my voice gave out, but no one came. Meanwhile, after 6 hours, my parents noticed I was missing. By the evening, they were panicking.
Have you seen Manuel? He told me he was going out for a bit.
He didn't say anything to me. Maybe he's with his friends.
They searched the neighborhood, called my friends, and contacted the police. When they reached out to my grandfather, his response was cold, and he pretended to not know where I was.
Why would I care? I'm glad he's gone.
That night, I sat in the darkness, weak from hunger and thirst. I felt hopeless, abandoned, and terrified. After 2 days of being kidnapped, I suddenly heard screams from my grandfather.
Fire! Fire! Somebody help me! Fire!
I was scared. If the house was on fire, I needed to get out. In my desperation, I found a window covered with wooden planks. It was my only chance. With what little strength I had left, I began pulling at the boards. It took a little time, and my hands were raw and bleeding, but I finally created a gap big enough to squeeze through. Once I was out, I saw smoke coming out from the front door. I didn't know how to help, so I rushed to the nearest house, pounding on the door until a neighbor answered. "Call the fire department. My grandfather's house. It's on fire." Fire trucks arrived within minutes, but the flames were already raging. I watched in horror as they battled to control the blaze. The firefighters managed to rescue my grandfather, but he was severely burned. Apparently, my grandfather had fallen asleep in the kitchen with a cigarette in his hand. The fire had spread quickly, consuming the front of the house. We were both taken to the hospital where my parents and our other family members were called. They were shocked to see me. I told them the truth about my kidnap, and the family was devastated. My adoptive parents were heartbroken and furious, unable to understand how someone could be so cruel.
How could you kidnap your grandson? I know you hate him, but how can you be so cruel?
I'm ashamed to call you my father. You deserve this. Cruel.
My grandfather, lying on a stretcher, didn't even try to deny it. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't because he was in a critical condition. The burns were severe. For days, he lingered between life and death. During that time, the story spread through the other family members and the community. People were horrified. The man they once respected was now known as a monster who tried to kill his grandson because of a grudge. When he finally passed away, no one mourned him. His reputation was destroyed, his legacy tarnished. At his funeral, only a handful of people attended. There were no flowers, no heartfelt eulogies. He was buried quietly, like an outcast, and the family moved on, determined to forget the man who had brought so much pain. My adoptive family didn't stop loving me. They made me believe I was more than his hatred. I was loved, and that was all that mattered. I was determined to never let them down, so I focus on my studies. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.